Привет, друзья! G'day guys, welcome to another Soviet lens review. Today we are taking a look at the MC Volna-9. It is one of the only Soviet macro lenses ever produced, and we're going to find out whether or not this lens is worth picking up and shooting on today. So let's get into it. Okay guys, first up, some history about this lens. Of course, it is a 50mm f2.8 lens, and it was originally designed in the late 70s apparently, and manufactured in the kind of late 80s into the very early 90s through the end of the Soviet Union. My copy here, as you can tell from the first two digits of the serial number, was manufactured in 1991, and you can also see the logo there for Elzos, or Litkorino optical plant just next to that. Now this lens was put on paper at the State Optical Institute, or GOI, of the USSR, and when it was designed, the designers definitely focused on macro characteristics, and that's why even though this lens only has a 1:2 macro reproduction ratio, it's still kind of safe to call it a macro lens, because really that is what the lens designers were aiming for. And they designed this lens to have 6 elements in 4 groups. So unlike its brother, the Industar 61LZ, which was a Carl Zeiss tessar-based classic kind of tessar design with 4 elements, this is a very native Soviet design with those 6 elements in 4 groups. And as well as that, the optical formula is different because it is a sonar-based design using a double Gaussian kind of optical layout as well. As well as that, this is one of the first and only Soviet lenses to use a floating element design. And what that means is that when you actually turn the focus ring, the floating elements inside of the lens, they are what moves. It's not just the whole optical block. And what that allows any lens with that design, but particularly the MC Volna-9, to do is to have a little bit more resolution when it's focusing very, very close. And it can focus very, very close. So on to that now, some technical specifications. The minimum focusing distance for this lens is 0.24 meters. The focusing scale actually goes a little bit closer than that, so it can focus closer than 24 centimeters, and that allows it to get that macro reproduction ratio of 1:2, which, you know, compared to today's modern macro lenses, which have a minimum of a 1:1 macro reproduction ratio, it's obviously not the most impressive spec on paper, but we're going to see how that actually plays out in real life. As well as that, this lens is 340 grams. Ergonomically, it is just a classic Soviet lens, all metal, all glass construction, and it just feels really, really nice to use. That's one of the best points about this lens, is the ergonomics, because the focus ring, it is clickless, goes from f2.8 through to f16, and it does have a an aperture preset mechanism. And to activate the aperture preset mechanism, you just pull down on the aperture ring, you set it to whatever value you want to set it to, and then it won't go past that value. Now, also in terms of aperture, the MC Volna-9, it has 6 aperture blades, which actually form some pretty interesting star or saw or even ninja star shaped bokeh that you can also see in the MC Industar 61LZ. And it has a resolution on paper of 42 lines per millimeter in the center of the frame, through to 30 millimeters, lines per millimeter, I should say, in the edges of the frame. Now, in Soviet specs terms, 30 lines per millimeter towards the edges of the frame is actually a very high amount of resolution, but we're going to get into the sharpness of the lens later, because what's on paper actually takes some deciphering to understand. One other fun fact about the MC Volna-9 is that if you purchase a reverse adapter for it, which I have, you can actually mount it in reverse on your camera, and you will be able to achieve a 1:1 reproduction ratio. And sort of that was kind of how a lot of, you know, photographers back in the day in the Soviet Union potentially would have done it, either with a reverse ring like that, or probably more commonly with some macro rings as well, because M42 macro rings, you can still find them, very common today, very common back in the day as well. And if you really need more than a 1:2 reproduction ratio, then you can go and get yourself a couple of macro rings, stick them on here, and get even closer than that 24 centimeter minimum focusing distance. Now onto some photo characteristics of this lens. One of the best things about the MC Volna-9 is that it does not display chromatic aberrations almost at all. Whether we're talking about fringing, which is kind of that purple or blue fringe that comes into contrasting edges, as well as that longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is the color shifts in the out of focus areas, is also extremely well controlled on the MC Volna-9. And I think that was definitely one of the things which the lens designers of the Volna-9 took into account, because when you read the manual for this lens, which I thankfully got with my copy, it says that one of the things that it can be used for is text and reproductions. As well as that, it mentions that it can be used for, you know, museum photography and architectural details. And really what that kind of translates to is that this lens has very, very few distortions as well. So it has almost no distortion. It has a tiny bit of pincushion distortion when you are focused close, but that is very easily correctable in post. And if you actually just crop in 10%, then the rest of the frame is pretty much straight, which is a really good thing. And obviously why the Soviets, you know, felt that they could claim that this was, you know, a great lens for architectural details and text and reproductions. Now, I wouldn't go ahead and, you know, try and use this for scanning film, for instance. I don't think it's going to be kind of quite good enough for that, but overall distortions are not a thing that you find in this lens. As well as that, this lens is pretty good for vignette as well. There's a little bit of vignette wide open, but stop it down and it really is pretty much not noticeable whatsoever. One other cool feature of this lens is its lens kind of inbuilt hood, I want to call it, because the front element of the MC Volna-9 is set so far back in the lens that similarly to the Industar 61 LZ, the kind of body of the lens makes its own hood, which does actually really help in protecting it from kind of side light, some flaring from, you know, lights that are coming in from the side of the frame, particularly well. I still think that if you're using some really powerful lights that could reflect off your subject, for instance, in macro, I have done some tests and you still want a lens hood there. A lens hood is, you know, ubiquitously helpful across all Soviet lenses. So, you know, don't just think you can get away without a lens hood for this lens because it's got the recessed element. You still probably want one. Okay, let's talk about sharpness of the MC Volna-9 now. So what I did is I took a few sharpness test shots and I put those results into a program which I've written, which essentially calculates a sharpness value on an algorithm very similar to modern cameras' focus peaking algorithms, and it spits out a value for me. So we can see what happened there. And you can see that at f2.8, this is not a sharp lens. This lens really struggles at f2.8. It does sharpen up a little bit by f4. f5.6, you're starting to get into the money, but really this is one of those lenses where if you want something to be sharp, stop down to f8 or f11, and that is when it's going to be at its sharpest. And there is a very good reason for that. And that reason is because this lens, one of its only weaknesses, I would say, is its field curvature. And what that means essentially is that in correcting this lens for, you know, all of those other distortions and chromatic aberrations that I have talked about, one trade-off and compromise that was made was that effectively, yeah, the lens has some field curvature, which means that when you focus the MC Volna-9 to the center of the frame, it is actually not focused also to the corners of the frame. The corners of the frame are in a different focal plane, which is pretty disappointing because you can see here that, you know, the corners of the frame, when they are actually in focus, they look great. They look nice and sharp. There's lots of resolution there, that 30 lines per millimeter that the tech specs talk about, but you're not going to get that most of the time unless you are stopped down to, you know, something like f11 where just all of that, you know, area in the frame is going to be in focus anyway. So that's really, really disappointing. And as well as that, the sharpness of this lens at infinity is also not that great because of the design that is optimized for focusing a lot closer. Now, onto some other negative characteristics about the MC Volna-9. The bokeh is one of the ugliest, probably the ugliest bokeh I have seen on any Soviet lens that I own. It is really not nice. It's busy. There's overlapping patterns. It is not circular. It is terrible, the bokeh on the MC Volna-9. So don't try and get too artistic with it. The field curvature as well. Now, it is an f2.8 lens, and of course, when you're talking macro shots, you're never going to shoot at f2.8. You're going to want to stop it down f11, f16, f22, which this lens does not have, to get more things in focus. And the issue is really, it doesn't really have that f22 aperture for when you really want a nice long depth of field. And if you're trying to use it as a bit more of a regular normal lens, not in macro, it's only an f2.8, which is, for a 50mm, you kind of want more, particularly when you're using a vintage manual focus 50mm. You want another reason to, to shoot with it. And with an f2.8 aperture, it just really doesn't give you that extra reason. The other negative thing about this lens is its coma. And wide open, it just shows horrendous levels of coma in the edges of the frame, and that's again potentially due to the field curvature issues. But you do not want to be shooting any astrophotography with this, and you want to be really careful when you take it out at night as well, because anything in the frame, any light sources, they're just going to turn into coma smears around the edges. But in terms of other photo characteristics, the MC Volna-9, look, it is very contrasty. When you get up nice and close, when you use that reverse adaptering, so you can get that 1:1 macro reproduction ratio, or even a couple of macro rings to add to the end of the lens here, you can definitely get some very fun, very sharp macro shots. And I think if you are considering buying this lens, I think it's worth saying that that's really the only strength of this lens. As much as I wanted to love it, as much as it is such a fun lens to use ergonomically and has a fantastic focus ring, great focus throw, great aperture preset ring, unfortunately, after testing it for over 3 weeks now, I just have not had much success using this for anything but macro. There is really no reason to own this over a Helios 44, over a Zenitar M 50mm f1.7, over even an Industar 61LZ, which is a lens half the price of the Volna-9 as well, if you're looking for something that can do, some of those slightly closer semi-macro shots. So at the end of the day, I think if you want to add something to your collection that is a fun macro lens, definitely consider picking up the MC Volna-9. But outside of that, I really can't recommend it to anybody. But there you go, guys. Hopefully that shed some light on the MC Volna-9. Let me know what you think of the lens in the comments, or any other lenses that you think I should review in the future. But for now, remember to subscribe to Soviet Lens Reviews on YouTube, and I'll see you in the next one.